The tape recorder was running when she stopped the interview. Not stopped in the sense of ending it. She didn't stand up, didn't ask him to leave, didn't reach across the table and press the button that would silence the machine. She stopped it the way certain conversations stop when something shifts underneath them, mid-sentence, without announcement, with the particular quality of a pause that communicates that what was happening before this moment is no longer what is happening. The journalist's name was David Felton. He was 28 years old, a staff writer at Rolling Stone, which in April 1969 was the most important music publication in America, and knew it. He had been given 2 hours in a hotel room in midtown Manhattan, and a subject who had, in the 18 months since Monterey, become one of the most written-about voices in American music. He had prepared extensively. He had read everything that had been written about her. He had a list of questions that were, by the standards of music journalism in 1969, sophisticated, not the standard biographical inventory, not the what does success feel like questions that she had answered so many times she could answer them in her sleep and sometimes seemed to. He was on question 11 of 22 when she stopped. She had been good up to that point. Not in the performed sense, she was never simply performing in interviews, was always somewhere in the vicinity of genuine, always giving the journalist enough of the real thing that the piece would have substance. But she had been in the familiar register, the register she had developed over 2 years of being interviewed, the voice that was candid and warm and slightly larger than life and gave you everything you came for and nothing you didn't come prepared to receive. Question 11 was about her influences. It was a reasonable question. It was, in fact, a question she had real and interesting things to say about: Bessie Smith, Big Mama Thornton, the blues tradition, the specific recordings that had given her a language at 17 when she had not previously understood that the language existed. She had started answering it. She had said Bessie Smith's name. She had begun the sentence that would explain what Bessie Smith had given her, and then she stopped. She looked at the wall, not at Felton, not at the tape recorder, at the wall of the hotel room, which was the wall of every hotel room, cream-colored, slightly textured, a generic framed print of something inoffensive at approximately eye level, the kind of wall that exists in thousands of identical hotel rooms across America, designed to be looked at without being seen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me something nobody's asked before." David Felton held his pen above his notepad. The tape recorder ran. The wall held whatever she had been looking at in it. And Janis Joplin, 26 years old, in a midtown Manhattan hotel room in April 1969, waited to see what would happen next. To understand what she was asking for, it helps to understand what the preceding 2 years of interviews had been. Since Monterey, since the afternoon in June 1967 when the world had decided it needed an opinion about her, she had been interviewed with a frequency and intensity that belonged to a specific category of public figure. The one the culture has decided is both remarkable and available, remarkable enough to warrant attention and available enough that the attention feels entitled to go wherever it wants. The interviewers were not, for the most part, malicious. Some of them were genuinely curious. Some of them were good journalists who brought real intelligence to the conversation and asked questions that reached something true. But even the best of them arrived with a framework already assembled, the Janis Joplin that the culture had constructed from the Monterey footage and the record covers and the reviews and the photographs and the preceding interviews. And the framework was both accurate and incomplete, the way all frameworks are both accurate and incomplete, and it tended to organize the conversation around the things it already knew rather than the things it didn't. The questions were variations on a small number of themes. The voice, where does it come from, how does it feel to use it, what does it do to you? The success, how does it feel to have arrived here, what does the audience mean to you, what happened after Monterey? The image, the feather boas, the southern comfort, the freedom, the abandon, the whole assembled public self that had become, in the 2 years since Monterey, something almost independent of the person it was assembled around, something that the culture needed her to maintain regardless of what the maintenance cost. The origins, Port Arthur, the difficult years, the long road from there to here, the story of the outsider who had become the center, which was the version of the story that the framework needed because it confirmed what the framework already believed about the relationship between suffering and art. She had answered all of it. She had answered it honestly within the available framework, and the answers had been good, quotable, substantive, genuinely reflective of something real in her experience. The profiles that resulted were accurate as far as they went. They captured the version of her that the framework could hold, but the framework left things out, not by design, not through the laziness or bad faith of the journalists who brought it. Simply because frameworks are finite and people are not, and the things that don't fit the available categories tend to remain outside the conversation regardless of how willing the subject is to discuss them. What remained outside the conversation in the 2 years since Monterey was the specific interior territory that the framework had no coordinates for. Not the difficult things, those were present in the interviews, handled with varying degrees of delicacy, but the specific. Questions that would have required the interviewer to not know something, to arrive without a framework, to ask from a place of genuine uncertainty rather than organized curiosity. No one had asked those questions, not because they couldn't, but because you can only ask from where you are, and where most interviewers were was inside the framework. She had been waiting, with a patience that was not entirely patient, for someone to arrive without one. David Felton had arrived with question 11 of 22 and a very thorough framework, and she had looked at the wall and asked him, politely but directly, to set it down. The silence lasted long enough that Felton would describe it afterward as the longest professional silence of his career. He said later, in a small retrospective piece he wrote many years after, when the interview had acquired the significance that time gives to certain exchanges, that he had understood immediately what she was asking for and had been unable to provide it. He had prepared for 22 questions. He had not prepared for the question behind the questions. He held his pen above the notepad. He tried to think of something nobody had asked her before. He ran through his prepared questions, the ones he hadn't gotten to yet, looking for anything that wasn't a variation on the established themes. He thought about the interviews he had read, the questions other journalists had asked, the territory that had been covered and the territory that hadn't. He thought about Big Brother and the holding company and the Cosmic Blues Band and the Pearl sessions that were underway at Sunset Sound, all of it already covered, all of it already part of the framework. He thought about Port Arthur, which every profile addressed and which she had discussed with the particular directness of someone who has told a story enough times to be able to tell it without it costing very much any more. He could not find the question that had not been asked. The silence continued. The tape ran. The cream-colored wall held whatever she was looking for in it. Felton would write years later that the silence had lasted approximately 90 seconds and had felt like considerably longer, the specific temporal distortion of a professional situation that has departed entirely from its professional parameters and is operating by different rules that no one in the room has agreed to and no one can quite identify. And then something happened that he had not anticipated and that he would spend considerable time afterward thinking about. Janis Joplin asked herself the question. She turned from the wall and looked at the tape recorder, not at Felton, at the machine, and she said, "Here's what nobody's asked me. Nobody's asked me what I think I would have been like if I'd been happy in Port Arthur." She paused. She said, "I think about that sometimes, not in a sad way, in a curious way, like what's the version of me that fit the room? What does she look like?" Felton did not move. The tape ran. She said, "I think she's quieter. I think she finds a way to be interested in smaller things. I think she probably gets married early like everyone expected. And I think she's fine. I think she's genuinely fine, not miserable, just contained within the available space." She paused again. She was looking at the tape recorder still, speaking to the machine rather than to the man, which gave the words a different quality, more interior, less performed, the quality of thinking out loud rather than explaining. She said, "The thing is, I don't think she makes the music. I don't think the contained version of me makes the music, because the music comes from the part of me that didn't fit. That was always too much for the room. And if the room had been bigger, if Port Arthur had been bigger, if I'd fit, I think that part of me wouldn't have needed to get so loud." She picked up the Southern Comfort. She set it down without drinking. She said, "So I guess what I think is Port Arthur made the music, the not fitting made the music, and I can be grateful for the music and still wonder what the other version would have been like. They're not the same question." She looked at Felton then, for the first time in several minutes. She said, "That's what nobody's asked me, whether I can hold both of those things at once." Felton found the question then, or rather the question found him, which is how the best questions tend to arrive. He said, "Can you?" She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not absence but the opposite of it, a quiet that is full, that is doing something. She said, "Most days, not every day, but most days." And then she smiled, not the big performance smile, the smaller one, the one that arrived when something was true and she knew it was true and the knowing of it was its own sufficient thing. She said, "Okay, what's question 12? Felton looked at his notepad. Question 12 was about the Cosmic Blues Band. He asked it. She answered it. The interview resumed in the familiar register, the framework reassembled. Around them, the tape continuing to capture what it captured, but the machine had also captured the other thing. The thing before question 12, the self-asked question and the answer to it, the wondering aloud about the version that fit the room, the conclusion that Port Arthur had made the music by not being large enough to contain her. Felton used it in the piece. He placed it near the end after the standard biographical material and the quotes about the music and the band and the tour. He set it up simply. She stopped the interview and asked herself the question nobody had asked, and let it run without much editorial apparatus because it didn't need any. The piece ran in Rolling Stone in May 1969. A lot of people read it. A lot of people remembered it. A lot of people who had grown up in their own version of Port Arthur, their own too. Small room, their own verdict of too much, their own long accumulation of being told that the size of what they felt was a problem requiring management, read that section, and felt something that the preceding paragraphs had not quite produced. Not recognition exactly, because the circumstances were entirely different. Something more precise than recognition, the specific relief of hearing someone say the thing that exists in the gap between the question the world asks and the question you are actually carrying, not because she had said something new, but because she had said something that required her to ask the question first, which required stopping the interview, which required looking at a cream-colored wall in a midtown Manhattan hotel room and deciding that the framework had to be set down before the real thing could be said. Felton kept the section in the piece largely intact. He trimmed a few sentences, gave it a brief setup, let it run. He was a good enough journalist to understand that the best thing he could do with it was leave it mostly alone, that his job, in relation to those 300 words, was to create the conditions for the reader to receive them rather than to mediate between the words and the reader. He had not found the question she was asking for. But she had found it herself, with the tape running, in the particular quality of a silence that his inability to fill had made available. His not knowing had been, accidentally and productively, exactly what was needed. She had needed a journalist who couldn't answer to find out what she herself would say. The interview resumed, question 12 through 22. The Cosmic Blues Band, the tour schedule, the recordings in progress. The framework reassembled around them and held until the end of the hour, but the tape had captured the other thing, the middle thing, the thing that happened in the 90 seconds when the framework was down and the wall was holding her attention and the question nobody had asked was waiting to be asked by the person who needed to ask it. She had been giving interviews for 2 years by that April. She would give them for another 18 months after it. The career continued, the Pearl sessions, the recordings that were producing the most fully realized work of her life, the performances that the audiences and the reviewers continued to reach for words adequate to describe and continued to fall slightly short. But the Rolling Stone piece had a different texture than the others. Felton noticed it. The editors noticed it. The readers who wrote letters to the magazine noticed it, which they mentioned in their letters without entirely being able to say what they had noticed. What they had noticed was the sound of someone who had interrupted their own interview to ask themselves the question that mattered and had answered it without the apparatus of the framework getting between the question and the answer. It was a brief passage, maybe 300 words in the final piece, including Felton's setup. But it contained something that the other interviews, for all their length and thoroughness, had not quite contained, the specific quality of a thought being thought in real time, in front of a tape recorder, for an audience that was not yet present and might not understand it and was going to receive it anyway. She had needed to stop the interview to get there. She had needed to look at the wall and let the familiar register fall away and ask, from somewhere more honest than question 11 of 22, the question that the framework had no coordinate for. The contained version would not have done that. The woman who fit the room would not have interrupted her own interview to ask herself a question, would not have spoken to a tape recorder rather than a journalist, would not have said I can hold both of those things at once with the particular quality of someone who is deciding it is true while saying it, rather than knowing it already. Port Arthur had made the music. The not fitting had made the music. And it had made in a midtown Manhattan hotel room on an April afternoon in 1969, a moment that a journalist had not prepared for, and a tape recorder had captured, and a magazine had published, and readers had noticed without quite being able to say what they had noticed. What they had noticed was her, not the framework, not the voice as cultural fact or the image as symbol or the career as trajectory. Her, wondering at 26 what the other version would have been like, deciding she could hold both, asking for question 12, the tape ran, the wall held whatever the wall held. And the music, which had come from the not fitting, continued to go where it needed to go, which was everywhere, which was always everywhere, which was the only answer the not fitting had ever been capable of producing.